And hello, everyone. Are you all turkeyed out, fake turkeyed out? However you get your holiday meal, are you done with it? Because you recycle it at least once, right? Thanksgiving, post-Thanksgiving. And then by the time you get to Saturday, you should be on to the pasta and meatballs, fake meatballs or something. Or you should be ready to have something else. But if not, welcome to this program. It's Emil Guillermo. This is my podcast, secret podcast. Emil Amok's Takeout, my takes on all things considerable. This is our 800th show. And I did a show on Friday, but I ordinarily have Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez. So I thought, let's just do it on Saturday morning. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to bring up Dan in a second. And we'll have two mature Filipino-American guys talking about stuff, maybe about other Filipino-American guys who have passed on today, and other things about Filipino-American stuff. The subtitle of this show is WDAAAT, What Does an Asian American Think About Anything? And just a reminder, you can catch the program, some of the programs that I do on patreon.com/Emil Amok, EMILAMOK. Also on Substack, see the column, substack.com/@Emil Amok. You can see this maybe you're watching this on YouTube. You're seeing live on YouTube @Emil Amok 1. And then, of course, on Facebook. We love Facebook because the people who are so cool, they're not on anywhere else. They're on Facebook. And, you know, we go out there and people say, oh, there's Emil again. And then they let him go. But maybe you want to say, hey, we want to see Emil. We want to see what Emil has to say, especially when it's two mature Filipino-American guys talking, when he has Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez on, of course. So we'll talk about all that. I just want to say that I've made a breakthrough about how to deal with this impending. It's not a political apocalypse. Not yet. I mean, it could be. There's going to be resistance, but it's going to be different because a lot of people who you would figure would be key in the resistance are kind of like trying to be, are they sympathizers? Are they just going along, get along? No, I think it's different now because the only reason why he won is because he is slightly more diverse and has brought on people who would ordinarily be blue, but they voted red. So there's a kind of sameness between the two parties. And so we are kind of this is the new America. We thought the new America would be, all the people of color would be in charge, or like we would be driving the agenda. Well, we still are, but it's a more of a, if we get past the polarization and the vitriol, maybe we can work together, because there is something about us that is more in common, or that is more similar than dissimilar. Even though, you know, one side wants to deport all these other people from the other side and throw away the key. Yeah, we're going to get through all that. We got to get through the bluster. But I've taken the time this weekend just to sort of let it go. Eat my vegan roast, be vegan. It's helped. And I hope some of the columns I've written have helped you. If you check it out, substack.com/Emil Amok. Let me bring in my friend, colleague, when we get together, do a kind of weekend review. Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez, College of Ethnic Studies, San Francisco State University, Professor Emeritus. And we bring him in just to talk about things, and we make sure that we're in the right position. I put him on the extreme left, and I am somewhat more in the middle. And there he is, got a face full of mug in his mug. Daniel, how are you? Welcome to the program again.
Thanks for getting me during my morning coffee. And, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Yeah, good to see you.
even
I
though we just
wanted,
saw each other yesterday.
yeah, we didn't talk about what we usually talk. I mean, we were in another group's
Yeah,
thing,
we did, and
and
it was interesting to hear what people were saying, and maybe we should cover some of that a little later. But
yeah, yeah. I mean, look, what we're
let's
referring to is both of us are members of the Filipino American National Historical Society, and they were having like a little talk about the review of the year 2024, and it also included in the conversation Dorothy Cordoba, who is the she is the surviving founder of the Filipino American National Historical Society. And because of her and her husband, the late Fred Cordova, they really got Filipino American National History Month, October, established, and FONS is established. Still a little shaky sometimes because, well, just like other organizations, new people come in. But we had an interesting conversation about what 2024 was like, and what sort of important things were going on. I was interested in what you had to say about. Um, Remember, Dorothy was saying, what is a Filipino American? Is it people who are Filipino on both sides? Is it people who are half? Is it only the wealthy half Filipinos, like, or popular ones like I mentioned Olivia Rodrigo? I mentioned other Filipino Americans who are half. What did you think about when the conversation turned that way?
Well, there was another context, and that
Mhm.
other context was essentially who gets to define what's the definition of what is a Filipino? Who gets to define it? And part of that was a critique which I saw in the chat um, about from a long-standing member
Mhm.
and one of the longest-standing members of what I call the second generation. Uh, the first generation of Fonz, the founders, see themselves as Peter Jamaro would say, the bridge generation.
Right.
And during that conversation, one of the realities that came up, and I think you mentioned it as well in part of your talk, is
Mhm.
that we second generation American borns had more in common with the second generation pre World War II bridge generation than we did with all of the incoming generations, including domestic born, US born Filipino Americans. And that's true. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have a lot more.
I said that. Well. First of all, there's a kind of conflict of who's first and who's second. The first generation is the immigrant,
That's
right?
right.
All
Correct.
right, and so the second generation are the American born, and half. And all right, so whenever you come, the first generation for like me and you were our fathers who came in the 20s.
The first generation, exactly, is the
Yeah.
immigrant generation. That and another context, right,
Mm,
for that discussion was academics, right?
yeah.
Then and Dorothy mentioned that there was only one academic among the founders, and that was Albert Alsena,
Right. The late Albert.
PhD. Yes,
The late Albert.
late, unfortunately, he
Yeah.
passed away. He's had a long life,
Yeah. A
um,
couple
and
years ago.
part of the CSM system for decades. Really
Right.
good guy. And I had the honor of working with him on a couple of projects over the years. But at any rate, one academic. That's the point that Dorothy was making,
Right.
and she was essentially saying the reason they established funds, and I think Amy also another participant
Amy
backed her up
Lopez.
on this.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was because academics weren't doing it, and
Yeah.
they're right, they weren't. This happened to coincide the whole idea of starting a national Filipino American organization started in the late 70s. It culminated in the foundation of funds in the early 80s. Um, but ethnic studies just got started 10 years earlier, okay,
Yeah.
10, 11 years earlier. So we were seen at our establishment, okay, and for years afterwards as radicals. that we were doing something that was not acceptable by standard university or academic scholarliness.
But mostly not accepted because it wasn't white.
Well, yes, but that was what was radical.
Yeah.
That was considered radical. Inclusion was considered radical because mainstream historians, I mean, some of the people who are on strike, some of my colleagues that were well quoted in the newspapers and in academic journals at the time, because they were asked, "Why are you? What's your motivation?" And they said, "We were told in American history classes that we didn't matter,
Yeah.
that it was insignificant. We didn't make any real contributions to American society." And we had already started to learn from our own studies internally, right? From familial discussions and all that of what we had done in American society. World War II veterans who I grew up around, we're always talking about having participated as U.S. military, right, during World War II, and all of the things that they were assigned and how they accomplished them and the kinds of awards they received. I heard battle stories and all that while I was sitting under the rummy table, at big gatherings at different people's houses. And one of the things that we had most in common, including with your dad, who was not in the military, was the World War II experience, because it was as much a cultural experience as it was a socio-political experience, right?
Yeah.
And especially because much of the war was fought in the South Pacific and in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, and especially the Philippines in many regards. Okay,
Yeah.
so there's a whole identity thing that's connected again with the second generation born both before and after the Second World War that made us very much alike and at the same time very different from others. Now,
Yeah.
on the question of academics, once academics got started, right, and involved, the nature and of the culture, Fahn's culture, started to shift, and it started to shift towards uh, more academic presentations, right,
Yeah.
of the history, and people behaving maybe regarded, I'd say deservedly so, as experts in the field, because they were now being allowed, usually through an ethnic studies path,
Right.
right, to study Filipinos, Filipino Americans, immigration, and all that with a much greater depth and with scholarly aptitude.
Yeah.
Okay. The problem is that the founders of the organization were much more into telling their stories in an organic way, you know, much more personal, much more humanistic, right, rather
Right.
than scientific and objective. And so there's a clash, a built-in clash, okay? And
A
that
built-in, but it later came. It only came on as more younger Filipinos became, got into the
exactly,
academic route
exactly,
and became
exactly.
PhDs, and that was a thing that, oh well, finally, Fonz is legit. We have legit PhDs, and not just in history, but in
Yeah,
all disciplines. So then
yeah.
it got into psychology and other PhD type disciplines, and then suddenly Fonz is more elitist academic than it is populist and, as you put it, a kind of grassroots organic storytelling.
Well,
Um,
I don't believe that it's elitist, but I do think that the style has become much more academic. And in my chat response, which wasn't taken up in on online and in recorded, right? But in my chat response, I stated to someone that, yeah, the academic style is something that is alienating, you know,
mhm.
to a lot of people who want a more, like I said, organic kind of study of and access to stories.
Yeah.
And the most recently departed person who everyone would argue was one of the greatest lay historians, right,
Mhm.
was an educated person, but he was not an academic. Okay,
Right.
he was a part-time academic. He actually had taught classes on campus, and so there were people. He was a bridge. Peter Jamero is who I'm talking about, and
Yeah.
he was a bridge in many more ways than one. Okay,
Yeah.
he was a bridge between generations, but not in the way that was originally thought. Right, a bridge between their lost quote generation is what they
Yeah.
call themselves often. Right,
Yeah.
and later generations. He was also a bridge in terms of the way that the stories got told, and his method was much more. How can I say? It had a greater degree of warmth, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
it was a almost journalistic family journal,
exactly,
and
exactly,
seeing the community as a family,
right.
and it was relatable, and it did not have he did not have the cred of a PhD or that kind of academic cred, but he had the credibility of being a Filipino who had experienced these things as
Yes.
an older Filipino male who grew up in the 20s or was born in the 20s and then saw what was happening in the
Yeah.
labor
And,
camps.
and like many people of his generation, he was incredibly. He was an achiever.
Oh yeah.
And that
Oh
generation, the so-called bridge generation, was full of high achievers by American white standards. By
yes.
American white standards, okay,
Right.
and so they were in a way an answer to the question: what happens to the children of Generation One, of the first generation immigrants, most of whom were not well educated, okay,
Right.
most of whom came here out of the dire circumstances of economic stress, right? Of
Yeah.
Philippine poverty, okay? And they were motivated by that. They were motivated also by the responsibility, right, of sending money back to the Philippines and caring for the people that they had left behind. So that second generation response was in spite of, and here's the context that's missing, the abject racism that both the first and second generation met in the
Yeah.
period before the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that
And that
led,
was yeah.
go ahead.
And well, that was the thing that I wanted to point out, that came out
Okay.
through a
Okay.
conversation I had with Peter Jamero. And I was trying to figure out, well, what happened? What made us different? We were born here, and I don't call it second generation, but that's what we were. I just say the born here Americans
The
who were
American
of
ones, yeah.
Filipino descent, the American born, and he was on the early on the in the bell curve. He was early on, and I was later on in terms of where we were as part of that second generation American born. And I said, what was it? Why is, or as a, to try to figure out an explanation for our lives. And through talking to Peter, I realized it. And you just said it. We were American. We were born here, but we were treated like the immigrants, where there was
Sure.
no line of demarcation between they're the immigrants, they don't speak English, or they don't speak English well,
Sure.
and we are the American born, and we deserve better, don't we? We are Americans.
Even
That,
even as a personally, even as a child, I can numerous times I was asked by people, and where are you from? And I
yeah,
said, and in one instance, I was about maybe 6 blocks from St. Francis Hospital, which is where I was born. And
yeah,
I said, I'm from San Francisco. And
mm,
they'd say, okay, well, where are your parents from? And that was the satisfaction they were looking for when I would say from the Philippines. Then they said, oh, okay, right. Then that was all right. It was, but at other times I would get asked this, my, you speak English really well. So even as a child, I learned, well, I guess because I look this way, there's an expectation that I'm going to have an accent, and I'm going to have a quote broken English, right?
right.
And so I when I explained that I was born here, well, they kind of looked surprised.
Yeah.
There was a little
Well,
bit of surprise.
but Dan, you got to keep in mind also the history, and this is what I get at in my stories, that there wasn't an opportunity for Filipino American families because of the ratio men to female, and unless you were able to bring a wife over early, you don't have many true Filipino Americans on both sides. Dorothy
Yeah,
Cordova
yeah.
is one.
And Dorothy
You're,
Cordova also mentioned that indirectly when she
yeah,
said, most of my friends, and she's talking about her Seattle experience, most
Mhm.
of my friends were half Filipino. There were a lot of
Yeah.
mixed race Filipinos. In fact, most people who claim to be Filipino were only part Filipino.
Mhm.
And she said one of the biggest numbers of intermarriages was between Filipino and African American, and
Mhm.
then people launched into a kind of side discussion about the black porter strikes, right? The
Right.
Pullman
Which was
porter strike.
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because that's another aspect of Filipinos and blacks getting together in Chicago that many people don't know
Actually,
about. Was
well, actually, they were in conflict because the Filipinos were used as scabs,
yeah,
okay, initially, okay,
right.
but then Filipinos also identified with what was happening with the porters. They worked out their relationship, and in point of fact, a lot of the middle class families of African Americans that were able to live a middle class existence in the suburbs of Chicago by building their own communities, they also were joined by Filipinos who also
Yeah.
established families and had a good middle class existence. And so their experience was different from both the East Coast experience as well as the West Coast experience.
Yeah. And Dorothy kept mentioning because we are fixated on the Lariat Leong farm worker California migrant experience,
Right.
and that's it's a worthy story, and it was honored at the Department of Labor recently in their Hall of Fame. And Lariat Leong is important because not just because of the context of Cesar Chavez and the grape strike and the fact that Filipinos started it, but he was also important in the labor movement even before the grape strike.
Yeah.
But yeah, but the point that Dorothy was making was that these are all Filipino stories. We are all spread out throughout the United States, and East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, all different experiences, all stories worth honoring. And
Well,
I
and
think
that have only been partially told, actually.
right,
There has
right,
not been a good national book.
yeah,
There is only mention, right, in short articles
mhm,
and sometimes in anthologies of the
right.
Midwest experience and the East Coast experience. And then there's also diversity in the East Coast experience, right?
Oh yeah, I mean,
There's the the upper the Northeast experience, particularly concentrated around New York, right? And then there's the middle around Washington D.C. and Virginia, right? And there's even a Southern experience, okay, as
oh
well.
yeah, yeah.
Although a lot of that was transient. Okay, it was farm workers, right?
Or but you also have the military in Florida and
Absolutely,
you have
Texas,
the
Louisiana,
Louisiana.
yeah,
Yeah, and so you have a really varied Filipino American second generation experience after an initial first generation breakthrough through the military or
exactly,
Spanish galleons, or there were the Spanish galleon trade. My understanding is a boat would go from the south to the northeast and wind its way to the docks in New York, and there were a lot of Filipinos who came in that way.
right, right. There
Long
were
long time Filipinos.
the
you know
maritime thing was really big, and so there's
yeah,
Filipinos there all the time. And it was again another 20s to World War II, 1920s to World War II experience that's very little written about that. Okay,
yeah.
and there have been a lot of again mestizo Filipinos, mixed race or mixed ethnicity Filipinos who have not had their stories told.
Yeah.
I would every time I engage with fans, I always feel guilty because I haven't done enough of these stories.
Yeah.
I haven't
Yeah.
written enough of these stories, and we've got to get it together and organize in such a fashion that we sort of take on. Instead of doing it individually, like Peter Jamaro was able to
Yeah.
do for decades, right? I think we need to organize better and just assign it out, right, so that people
Well,
know what the others are doing.
well, see, this is the thing about what got to me because they made a big deal about Larry the Musical, which is not bad. Larry the Musical was good musical. Appeared at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. It wasn't, uh, you know, it was a breakthrough of sorts in terms, but there have been other Filipino American story, Bullison story about when that when his play, right, Magno.
Right.
Remember that play
Yeah,
that came?
I do.
And then they played
And
in
the
Scott.
same, that's one of the same major contributors to that, was also a major contributor to the
Right.
production of Larry.
And the Larry, I'm not taking anything away from Larry the musical, but I'm saying that there are so many stories in the Filipino American oeuvre, and I just wanted to point out that you had music. This is the first time for a musical, and people in the theater, they love musicals because musicals sell, musicals are commercial, and musicals are also a way that people relate to theater. I mean, theater is, it's not exactly as healthy as people think. You go to Broadway, and the shows that people gravitate to aren't the aren't the plays, aren't the thinking man's plays. It's the musicals. It's Lion King and things like that. And so I just pointed out that in my one man show that I brought to New York for 2 years running in the East Village, I talk about Filipino American history from the standpoint of a direct descendant of a person who experienced that uh, Filipino American history in the 20s. And I talk about that, and I put it in the context of 1587 and the first Filipinos who came. And I put it in the context of the 1899 Philippine American War. And I just pointed out that, I've supported Fonz for a long time. I was the executive director of the museum, raised a lot of money for the museum during the pandemic
The
when we were
Stockton
closed.
Museum. Yeah.
Stockton, yeah. But that was the National Museum, and that's what Fred Cordova wanted. He wanted the National Museum to be in his hometown. So, I helped support that museum during its worst time in history, and I got no support from anybody. I just pointed that out. I'm not trying to, no sour grapes on my part, but I'm just saying, you know, uh, we have many, the right way to look at the breakthrough of Larry Itliong, the musical, or Larry the musical, is people are telling stories that are Filipino oriented now. And that is a good thing. At the same time, this year, not only did you have Larry the musical, but you had which is like relative uh, relatively low, well, very low budget compared to the very high budget There Lies Love, which had a second run in Broadway, on Broadway, which is the Marcos story. And it had all the rich Filipinos giving money to that. And the only reason why it failed is because it was a multi-million dollar operation and they couldn't sustain it.
It's
They
very
closed.
expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Very
mean
expensive.
they when I saw it, it was a packed house. It was a great play. I loved There Lies Love. I loved the cast, and I thought it told the Filipino American story from the standpoint of the Marcos regime and the downfall of Marcos, and Filipino Americans who were here were able to relate to, oh, that's why I'm here. Younger Filipino Americans and people who follow Filipino American history that can say, oh, that's what happened there. And it was a beautiful, well told production, or well done production, but it closed. It didn't last through the next year. It didn't last through January, February, where they were hoping to continue. But it was sad. And yet, you know, then the Larry the musical comes along. It doesn't cost hundreds of thousands a month to put on. It had a nice run in San Francisco, and I think the general takeaway of all these, my show, Larry the musical, There Lies Love, is that Filipino stories are waiting to come out, and they're coming out now in other forms, non-academic forms, and they're telling the story. So that was my 2 cents at that meeting yesterday. We were trying to figure out what were the milestones in 2024, and milestone. There are a lot of milestones, but I
Well,
think it's. Go ahead.
yeah, the stories. Uh, I I think Dorothy was right to point out that the story is very incomplete, and that the story needs to be told better. Okay,
Mhm.
and it needs to cover a lot more history. And I thought Alan Bergano's idea of going through the year was a good one. But there were
Yeah.
a lot other smaller stories, right?
Yeah.
That were
Yeah.
going on locally,
Mhm.
including elections, and that where Filipinos were actually winning seats, and
Mhm.
only one was covered, right?
Yeah.
In that discussion, and that was the first and worthy. It was a worthy
Yeah.
statement, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the thing about politics, I mean, hard grassroots politics, uh, unless it's a race that's always covered that everyone knows about, there's got to be some kind of catalyst that puts it on the map for people who don't consider politics to be sexy, but there's a
it's
something.
it's true. It's
So
true.
there's something in theater, there's a musical. I mean, they don't consider my one man show sexy, but they'll consider a musical about Larry Itliong
But you
sexy.
could, but Emil, you can make it sexy.
Oh
You
yeah,
can,
yeah.
you
I
can like
tried. I tried.
we should talk about that more off on the side, man. But you can make
Okay.
it sexy because
Oh, with another
Filipinos
star.
Filipinos were doing quite well despite the anti-miscegenation laws at the
Mm,
time. And in point
yeah.
of fact, one of the reasons that many let's say conflicts, physical
Mhm,
conflicts, and even killings occurred
mhm, mhm,
in the pre-war era, pre-World War II era, was
mhm.
because of Filipinos' amorous adventures. So
Oh yeah,
you
yeah.
can make it sexy.
Oh yeah.
But
I
the question is, are people going to find that acceptable? Because a lot
well,
of
I made
Filipinos
it.
here hated they Filipinos of my parents' generation
Yeah,
did not like Kearney Street.
yeah.
The
Oh
women
yeah.
especially hated Kearney Street. They saw it as a lagging time, right,
Mhm,
of the bachelor era that
yeah.
embarrassed them because Filipinos were
Oh,
seen as gamblers, drinkers,
that was my dad.
and
That was my
hanging with other women that were not Filipino, right? And so they didn't
yeah.
like that.
This is the thing, like I hear stories a lot about, oh, my father came from the Philippines and he got a college education, he became a lawyer and now he's a kingpin, that's a good story. That's a good mainstream story. The real story is a lot of Filipinos came and they were not they were educated in the colonial education in the Philippines that America gave them. But my father was essentially from a farm area, from
Majority of
Lawa,
them were. They were recruited specifically for that purpose to
right?
work in
And
agriculture, first in Hawaii and then here
right.
in the mainland.
And my father would not work in the fields. He wanted an easier job. So,
Mine too.
yeah, and so I'm not going to the fields, and he did not go to the fields. He knew what happened in Hawaii because he came later on in the 20s, and he didn't want the Hawaii experience. He bypassed Hawaii, the cicada experience, and he came to San Francisco and said, "I'm not leaving. I'm staying. I'm working in the restaurants. I'm joining the union." But he wasn't an organizer. He just wanted to get his money, gamble, drink, and have fun. And that was my dad. And I've
And that was 99% of the men who came over, even those who
right,
were already married, right?
right. I don't. I'm not making a judgment on my dad. I'm just saying, hey, that was who he was. And so, when I finally came
Well,
around
I
on the
guess you were
scene,
squeaky clean when you were going through high school and college, because
yeah,
I was not.
yeah. Well, I
I
was.
was my early life might look much like my dad's.
Yeah. Yeah, I was. I had a squeak or two, but not. I wasn't squeaky clean. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but this is the thing. This is the thing. That story of Filipino American life. I mean, there's so many things that we don't get. Like, it wasn't until I got. I saw the international hotel play that ACT put on from Lindley Tenorio's book that talked about the potential of gay relationships
Yeah, yeah,
amongst men. I mean,
yeah,
that is something that was always taboo, right? No one, because the
yeah.
Catholicism. I mean, well, if you're not going to talk about the homosexuality of your priest, you're not going to talk about the homosexuality in the bachelor communities.
Right.
So that was like an arm's length taboo, but you knew it had to happen, right?
Well, yeah, but we didn't. We weren't really. I think we were forced to to put it out in the open and recognize that it probably happened. Okay, and that was uncomfortable. That was uncomfortable for a lot of straight guys, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and initially, the writers who were getting some level of recognition by non-Filipinos, right?
Oh yeah.
As good writers who were writing about the Filipino experience, they didn't write about homosexuality. Okay,
Yeah.
so it was the women who raised the probability, and then who pushed the issue that it had to have happened, and then men had to recognize it, and so
See,
that was a 1970s kind
yeah.
of conflict.
But look, you mentioned something there. Who's the audience?
That's right.
Is it the whites? The whites who say, "Oh wow!" Like even Bullason had the people in the East Coast literary types, Carrie McWilliams. They were raving about, "Oh, what is this
Yeah,
voice?"
because they were a bunch of lefties. They
Yeah,
were super lefties. They needed a hero, and then Filipinos, they realized, were being overlooked, and we played a much more important story on the West Coast, and also we played specifically a tremendous story in terms of the development of both the fishing industry as well as the agricultural industry.
right,
Right.
right. Oh yeah. Well, I'm just saying that someone like Carlos Bullason and his migrant existence, throughout California up to the Alaskan Canaries and back, and
Yeah, but
I mean,
Alex and I and Oscar Penaranda and a bunch of other guys said no, he couldn't have made it to Alaska because he was physically unfit, and it's true. He was he
oh,
was
all
he
right,
was in a sanitarium a lot because he
he
was a
was
heavy
not,
drinker, he was a
yeah.
heavy smoker, and he had bouts with tuberculosis.
But all right, my point was, the thought was he sort of encompassed the entire experience, although he could not, as you point out, be physically the guy at
Exactly.
Ward's
So,
Cove and also down to the Coachella.
well,
And
he was popularized again by the white left. Okay.
right,
He was popularized, he got the opportunity to be published by the white left. Okay. There were other writers, PC Morante, Trinidad Rojo, right, who also wrote, but who were not as popularized by the white left. Okay. So this is why the West Coast story started being told, because when we started ethnic studies, right, the Japanese Americans came up with John Okada, right, as a person who told that story with No Boys, right, the World War II story about people being in concentration camps and then being asked to volunteer for the U.S. military to fight the Second World War and eat a bowl of tea.
oh
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, Louis Chu, I think, was the author. And so
yeah,
they had these two guys, and they said, "What about you?" And we said, "Carlos Beloside," right? And that
yeah,
immediately translated to everybody picking up copies of Carlos Beloside's book and reading
America,
that, and he became heroified by that
yeah,
generation, or at least by the literary, the reader inclined portion
yeah.
of our generation, and
Well,
it got out of hand. It got out of hand. I mean, the
yeah.
guy
Well,
he had semi deific status,
yeah.
and
Well,
that was
that's
not
the thing, though.
realistic.
I
Pardon me?
mean, I said that's the thing about, you get one book and you catch a break, and then it catches fire. But it started from essentially writing to a white audience that
That's right.
accepted him. And I find when I do my one man show, I'm in the Lower East Side, and I get a white audience that's appreciating what I do. And the Filipinos, I've got to drag them, from Queens or from Brooklyn. I've got to, beg them to come to the show to hear the history about where they came from or what happened to early Filipinos, because a lot of those Filipinos from Brooklyn or Jersey, they came here in the 1980s. They came here in
I
2000.
was going to say, I was going to say, if they're first generation, they still have a first generation attitude.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of the things that Dorothy was
Cordova.
talking about, well, she wasn't just arguing it; she was asking a question, right?
Yeah.
Like, who gets to define what is a Filipino? Are we doomed to be less than, for just simply because we're born here? And the answer from me is yes, we are. From the perspective of first generation immigrants, they
Yeah.
see themselves as genuine, because they're from the Philippines, they speak the languages, right? And
Yeah.
therefore they see themselves as genuine. Once you have that attitude, and it is pervasive, right?
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly so,
Yeah.
even among the expats, once again, identifiable by their level of socio income, right? From their socioeconomic perspective. Uh, so there's a number of divisions and a semi-caste kind of division within the Filipino American community, and but the biggest single division, right, is first generation versus all following American born generations. Okay, and
So
there's
yeah.
continuous first generation arrival, right?
Right. And so whether you came in the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, the 80s, to 2010, 2020, if
Yeah,
you're first
yeah,
generation, you
yeah.
think you're better.
Yesterday, even.
Yesterday, if you came yesterday, you think you're better. You're more Filipino.
They're genuine, right? And by
Yeah.
that standard, they're right. Okay, but the problem is that it does lead to a conflict in who gets to tell what story, and so we get discounted all the time. We get discounted all the time. Oh, and I need to add, the Larry the Musical was important because from a musical perspective, it was very good.
Yeah.
The execution was outstanding. I mean, once again, I actually think that overall, I didn't see the New York production, but I listened to it and I saw clips. Okay, online, I was able to get clips online, and and yeah, it was good, particularly the lead characters, right? But it wasn't steady throughout. There were some people who were not as good as
Yeah.
singers.
Yeah.
Larry the Musical, every single one of the characters could sing like crazy, man. I mean, they were really good. And so,
Yeah.
from a quality perspective, I thought, man, that was outstanding, right?
All
It
right.
was
So,
outstanding.
and I bet you a lot of them were first generation.
You know what? The singers
Yeah.
in the Larry production,
Yeah.
I bet you they were all second generation.
I mean,
Gail,
maybe.
Gail, Gail, and Brian for sure, second
Yeah.
generation. I
Yeah.
mean,
That's true. That's true.
I also said that they were all SF State graduates. I mean, the production people,
Yeah.
and I mentioned that as well. So I believe that a number of them are now. Another production that was done, I think the first year was last year, was the Buffalo Soldier production by a
Didn't see that.
colleague of mine. At Yeah, you didn't know about this. It was held at the Oakland Museum of California
Oh,
History.
that's done by Callaway.
Yes, yes. And John is a colleague, right? He's
Yeah.
a
I
lecturer in
did.
the music department at SF State. He also taught in ethnic studies, right,
Yeah.
as well. And I know other members of his family. I know I'm acquainted with his older brother, Dennis. But
Yeah.
anyway, the point is, his production was also outstanding. I mean, it was really great, and he used a lot of SF State students
Yeah.
because those are the people that he has in contact with. Okay, so I got a chance to brag. That wasn't covered at all in our discussion yesterday,
Yeah.
and that Buffalo Soldier again tells the history of the colonization of the Philippines from a mixed race Filipino African American experience. Okay,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
is just outstanding in every
Well,
possible way.
a lot of people have tried to mine that. John Sayles had his movie out a couple years ago. A lot of people try, and they're more. I mean, it's ripe for the telling. People are. I know one really big Hollywood actor who contacted me, and just because when I mentioned Filipino, he said, "Oh yeah, we're working on something like that," and on the on
What's the historical subject matter?
um, Buffalo Soldiers,
Oh,
African
okay,
American,
okay.
and Filipino, and just really getting into that whole story that people have tried to get at. Like John Sayles tried in his movie a few years back. I forget the name of that movie, but it was about the Philippine American War. Um, and maybe he'll have the clout. I mean, a lot of it is, do you have the backing? Although if you have the backing, it doesn't mean success. I mean, look at Joe Coy had Easter Sunday.
Right.
He had the backing of Spielberg, and
Yeah, but it sucked.
well, it died. I didn't see the movie. I just know that he had the backing of Spielberg. He was pushing it like crazy, and it died. It
Yeah.
died.
Well,
So,
once
didn't last a
again,
week.
I cheated and watched the some of the YouTube clips and all that kind of stuff,
Of
and
what? Of Easter
afterwards,
Sunday?
yeah, Easter Sunday, and
Yeah.
it a lot of the stuff has been worked over by Filipino comedians.
Yeah. It was
You know,
probably kind of hacky.
besides Jokoy, I mean, there are guys who have been doing some of those same gags, or different, slightly different versions of those same gags, right? Since the '60s, man,
Oh
and
yeah.
so from a Filipino American perspective, particularly somebody like me, and I guess you as well, who's really into comedy and comedians and all that, right? And I've had several of my former students make it, to the stage, and with different levels of success, right? Because you had to have a straight job too. You
Yeah.
couldn't
Yeah.
just live off that. But man, putting that all, packing that stuff, especially the cornier stuff, into Easter Sunday is like,
Well, but the thing is, he wasn't selling it to Filipinos. He was selling it to whites, and not making it. But also, I think the thing is, the film form is different versus, you could get away with laughs and jokes on the corniest stuff in a club or in
Yeah,
an arena, but in a
yeah, yeah.
movie, it's not the same. It's
No,
not,
it's not.
not the
Different
same.
medium. Also, yeah, that it just, the stuff wasn't that funny, and
All
if
right,
it's
but,
not,
but go. All right, go. But get back to the idea that this is for white audiences. This is for Filipino audiences. Trying to attract the Filipino audience, because a lot of Filipino audience get really snooty and they don't. It's
that's
not good
not
enough.
real. Oh
And
man. Oh,
I only ride in a Lexus.
remember when
Only.
Debut came out, and
Oh
then
yeah.
people said that's not real life, and I thought, really, it's not.
But
it
the
got
and
it got attacked again from the left, the
yeah.
Filipino second and third generation left, because it was effete snobbery, because it looked like a middle class LA family, and I thought, uh. what did you expect to see, right?
All right. So this
You
is the thing.
want to, once again, that's PC, right? The same kind of thing that got the Democratic Party in trouble is they wanted to say, they wanted to romanticize, right, what's happening to people in the ghetto, and then at the same time they're ignoring, right, the
Yeah.
reality of the very middle class character
So
of the
so
Filipino American society.
so let's talk about that movie. That was called The Debut.
Debut.
Debut, Debut, and it was like a Latinos had quinceaneras.
Yeah,
This is
exactly.
this is the thing for Filipinos, and it was a movie by, God. I met the director. He's a good guy. Um, his name escapes me, but
Yeah, me
I,
too. But the
yeah.
writer that saved it, the script, was John Santos from,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, John Santos. Who did he? Didn't he do um, Crazy Rich Asians? Wasn't he part of that?
I think he worked on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and thank goodness, man, because it's hard to make a living doing that stuff. And
Yeah.
Crazy Rich Asians,
Made
was an
yeah.
economic breakthrough, right? I mean, it still gets watched now.
So the debut, people still watch the debut. You know what else people still watch? They still watch uh, the Col. What is it? Colma the musical. That was done by a Filipino guy. I
Oh
forget
yeah,
his name.
that's right.
They still watch that, and it's kind of a Filipino story. But
Yeah,
but anyway, the movies are different, and sometimes look, is it? But get back to the question: white audiences, Filipino audiences, because Filipinos, they get real snobby, and they say, "Oh, not for me," not for, or they get, or is this another example of that crab mentality, where I don't want to
it's
see another
okay.
Philip?
All three of the things that we have already talked about, right?
Mm,
Which is one, class, okay,
mm,
class differentiation; two, cultural difference, okay, first generation versus everybody else. Because even though they're now only about 1/3 of the total population of Filipinos, right? Because there are as many people being born here, right? Uh, they are they're 1/3 of the incoming population, but they have constituted over time 2/3, right? The first generation, 2/3 of the overall population. So
Right.
that's why they get to dictate what are the criteria for who's Filipino.
So
Okay.
it's so frustrating that maybe if you're a true artist, you say, screw this ethnic stuff. I'm Filipino. People can come to it if they want to or not. But well, it's open to everyone. And it's a story. It's my story. It's a story of the artist. Maybe I mean, and yet when you think back, oh, I could have been maybe more successful if I had marketed to the Filipinos. I don't think that works anymore.
Yeah.
I, I don't think
Yeah.
Filipinos care. They care about their story. They don't
Yeah.
care. They don't care about you know the Filipinos before them.
Yeah. That's always been the case, though.
Thanks,
Okay.
Dan.
One of the
Thanks,
one of
Dan,
the
for making me
criticisms
feel even more depressed.
one of the one of the criticisms. Oh, this will get to you too. One of the criticisms that Fred Cordova had, right? The great and late Fred Cordova. One of the first criticisms I ever heard him say is, "The goddamn first generation Filipino immigrants think that Filipino American history started with their arrival."
Right.
That was one of his major and lasting criticisms. And guess what? He was right. That's their
It begins
prejudice.
with me. Me.
And well, you know what? It's a pseudo class situation because they look with disdain at the pre World War II generation, the bachelor generation. They look at disdain with the post World War II arrival, right, of the so-called war bride generation, right? And they say those people were lower class. They were
Right.
lower, and it wasn't true any longer. Right after the Second World War ended, and especially when Filipino men who had been in the service or who stayed in the service started to get GI benefits, right, from the GI
Yeah. For the
bill.
service. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They moved rapidly into the middle class.
Yeah. But
They
you're right.
started
Yeah, but you're right in the sense that who comes subsequent to that? People who are educated, people who finally get the
exactly.
break, people who have been to university. Oh, I've been to Ateneo. Oh,
Well,
I
especially if they went to the big Catholic universities. Yeah.
right, and they are they're a different breed. They sometimes they have money, and it's enough to start something when they come here, and when they come here, they are different, and they say, "Wow, we're a different kind of Filipino.
We're
We're not,
better. We're
yeah, we're
better.
better. We're better. We're not
We're
the
better.
American Filipino."
They got into parish organizations and said, we're better leaders just
Yeah.
instantly because of their status, and it caused a lot of conflict. It
Oh
caused
yeah.
a lot of conflict, man. And that's why I call it pseudo class attitude because they really weren't different. My parents were as middle class as they were. In fact,
Yeah.
my parents bought their first house earlier than many of them. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so
If they were lucky, if they were lucky to get, I mean, sometimes the Filipinos who are true Filipinos, like my family, we rented our entire lives.
I
They
knew
had
a
to
lot
get,
of families like that. I knew
they-
families that came here and they were stuck in the south of Market, and in some cases in project housing for a full generation. They,
yeah,
they had kids that grew into adulthood in those circumstances. But then there were others who moved out of that rather quickly, okay, but not as quickly as the pre World War II men who then married as a
oh yeah,
result of World
yeah,
War II and then got GI benefits, right? They
right,
moved rapidly into the middle class.
right. But then you take those people and compare it to the people who come in 2000 or become, oh, we're escaping Marcos, and we like to live in, St. Francis Wood, or we're escaping Marcos. We like to live in. We can afford a little better house, and we can afford. We just don't want Marcos to get our money. How do they look at those previous Filipinos? They're just
Yeah,
Just
they were just as
better.
bad as they were just as bad as the World War II moms, who got
Yeah.
married during World War II, and they hated any reference to like Kearney Street or
Yeah,
places
but
like
you know,
Kearney Street.
but they become these subsequent first generation types with more money become the white Filipinos. They become the white Filipinos.
Whoa, man, what does that mean? White Filipinos.
Well, I mean, in terms of class, I mean, in terms of they see themselves as better than the other Filipinos.
Okay, well, see, that's my question: is do they become white Filipinos from an outsider or a Filipino second generation, third generation point of view, or do they become white Filipinos because that's the way they see themselves?
They see themselves as superior. That's a
Okay,
problem.
well,
The enemy within the Filipino community is within.
well, yeah, it's in and out. I think, but you're right. I agree with you. They made this. Many of the Filipino, especially mestizo leaders of the Filipino American community, they
Mhm.
literally compared themselves to white.
Yeah.
And they did it directly and indirectly. When I say literal, I'm saying they say we're as good as we're the only people we're capable of earning the respect of white people. So they
Yeah.
literally did that. They also did it indirectly by saying things like we're not like other minorities that are challenging the white America because of what their racist treatment of people was. Because we're here to join with
Ah,
Americans, and work with them because we understand what it is to become American, right? And that's,
because we go along to get along.
no, we called them sellouts. When I was a kid, we called them cop outs, sellouts, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
I mean, but that there's a certain number of Hillsborough Filipinos who are like that now.
well, yeah, yeah, and some of them were former political leaders in the Philippines.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, and this is our community. We're a community where we are all pretty much on our own, and you want to unite as a Filipino community. And then look, we haven't even begun to reach out to Asian American community, which is another broad umbrella. That
Some of us have. I mean,
Yeah,
I certainly benefited from that relationship,
yeah,
but at the same time, I've had former students with whom I at one time at least maintained close contact, and there were times in our lives where they questioned whether or not the Asian American concept was a valid vehicle. By valid, I mean an effective vehicle for Filipinos to gain some kind of political and recognition. But again, there's prejudice there. There's prejudice from Japanese Americans, from Chinese Americans, and the
and
Chinese American prejudice takes different forms, and it also the difference in form comes along with generation. When did they arrive? What
right,
was the relationship between the Philippines and China or Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore at the time, right?
yeah,
That of their arrival. And
oh yeah,
Filipinos were seen again as lower class. The same thing happened to Filipinos, in our reputation in Europe, right?
yeah, yeah,
One of the ways of criticizing someone, particularly if they treated someone as though they were subordinate, was they would say, "I'm not your Filipino." They would
yeah,
actually use Filipinos a basis of comparison. You're treating me like one of them,
yeah,
okay? And we're talking about Filipinos now who were very valued all over Europe and in England, right? Because they were well educated, and nannies,
yeah,
and other professionals as well, art, writers, editors, and engineers,
yeah.
accountants,
But
nurses.
but this is all perpetuated when Filipinos stuck in the diaspora because there's no economic, vibrancy in the Philippines. They've got to seek work in Saudi Arabia. They got to seek work in Europe and Israel. They got to seek work elsewhere.
And it's
And so,
it's an upper class problem.
Yeah.
It's an upper class problem. I have a
Upper class
fictive.
in the Philippines.
Yes, I have I have a very upper class fictive cousin who was kind
Fictive.
enough to
Not
house me.
really. Not
Yeah,
really a
no, not
cousin.
blood related, but
Yeah.
because our fathers had a World War II relationship, there was
Yeah.
a strong bond there between the two families, and that also existed between my mother's side as well as my father's side.
Yeah.
My father's side because of the war, my mother's side because of proximity to the family in Cebu, right? So
So,
that
so
kind of thing.
many fictive relationships, me
Fictive
too.
relationship,
Fictive,
but
fictive.
yeah, but it's even better than freaking blood relation because
Yeah. Yeah.
this family put me up,
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
month at a time when I was in the Philippines and I was teaching at UP,
Yeah.
and I'll never forget their kindness, and so there's a good relationship there. He was high up in SGV, one of the big accountancy firms in Southeast Asia, and he uh, had a very simple statement. He said, "All you got to do is actually pay the people what they're worth. If we paid the people a working wage, if we paid the people what they're actually worth, right, the vast majority of problems in the Philippines would be resolved, including and especially because I raised corruption as an issue, and including corruption, including low level corruption, police authority, military authority, and all the rest of that. And I have to admit, I mean, that's a credible position, right?
Mhm.
And he was willing to do that. He was Now there were also candidates all the way up and down the national government that were also willing to do that. There were members of the upper class in the Philippines that were willing to engage in that kind of reform. The problem is there's also a corrupt criminal class of
Mhm.
upper class, and they were going about literally killing judges, lawyers, and journalists, right? Remember
Mhm.
that period,
Oh
in
yeah.
the
Yeah.
90s and the 2000s.
Yeah.
uh, and it so they're the ones who need to be let's say lessened in terms of their level of influence on the society at large. But then you look at the United States and you look at the level of criminality in the United States that is now above board, right? It's in your face and obvious, and people sanctioned it by
Yeah.
voting it into office. It's disgusting. And then people say it's like a third world country. You made it that way, fool.
Well,
You
the
made
thing
it
is,
that way.
people. I have relatives who are part of the diaspora, but they have to go back. They go back.
Yeah,
It's
that's
not.
true.
It's not to.
That is a relatively recent phenomenon. I would say within the last 20 years. But there's an increasing number of people who say it sucks here. We're going back to the Philippines,
Yeah.
and I can only hope that when they go there, they are become part of that political group, right? That
Yeah.
stands for reform. But
Yeah.
there's only so much you can do before people start shooting at you. You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing about the Philippines because it's so autocratic and everything is like when, Marcos, got on the, uh, or, or actually the vice president, um, Duterte's daughter, Sarah Duterte, said that, I'm going to, when you get me, I'm going to get you. I'm going to put a contract
Right,
out
there it
on
is.
Marcos. And Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said, "Hey, we're going to investigate," and that's caused the whole thing.
Yep.
Now in the
Yep.
and that's
It's really
maybe
interesting. It's really interesting because everybody on the left that was critical of his dad are also critical of him, right? Of Junior. And
right,
you
but
know,
more so
but
now you got to be critical of Sarah Duterte a little bit too because she's like going for the guns.
yeah,
And
yeah.
the column I wrote was saying, well, once again, if people say America is becoming a banana republic or becoming, like the Philippines, well, the Philippines can. This is the Philippines' turn now, and the Philippines they need immunity in the Constitution so that Sarah Duterte and Bernard Marcos can say anything they want and threaten each other,
Uh,
and so
yeah,
they
well,
could be
and that's the interesting thing, right? Because the Supreme Court in the Philippines has held most of its integrity,
yeah,
and the Supreme Court in the United States has become wholly corrupted.
yeah. Yeah, I mean
It's a
the
laugh riot.
right the democracy that gave democracy to the Philippines is now degenerating. And I was just in my column in the Inquirer.net was saying how the Philippines can improve and become as bad as American democracy. They need to,
Okay, okay. I'm going to make an academic argument, but it's fact based, right? What the
yeah.
United States brought to the Philippines was titular democracy,
Titular, yes,
titular democracy.
titular,
Okay,
yes, yeah.
yes, only in name, right? So
Oh,
Philippines was a democracy in name only. Okay, it's never
titular.
really had full. Actually, it's gotten closer, in during certain recent times to
Mm,
being an actual democracy than at previous history. And
yeah.
I think under Fidel Ramos, for example, it moved closer to being a democracy during that
Yeah,
period.
Fidel also super colonized West Point.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah.
Really,
Also,
Super
uh,
Americanized.
okay,
Now,
well, you might as well put the Ilocano lock on him too, because he was
yeah,
also
yeah, that was it. But
Ilocano.
we need to talk about that Americanization and that assimilation because when you become assimilated, I mean, maybe that's what we're seeing when subsequent Filipinos come here. They have more class, they have more money, they have more class in terms of they're just wealthier. They see themselves as equal to Americans, and they their drive is to assimilate and be like Americans. I call them the white Filipinos, but they're just more assimilable. They want to be assimilated.
There was a lot. There's a lot of that even in the second generation, pre-World War II, second
Right,
generation, because
right,
they got recognized for
yeah,
their abilities.
right,
Many of them as individuals got recognized for their abilities.
yeah,
Um, they also excelled, especially the ones that went to public schools, right?
yeah,
All over the West Coast, they excelled in everything.
yeah,
As not only in school but also in athletics, and they won statewide competitions, things like that.
yeah,
So even though they wouldn't make it to the pros, some did, but
yeah,
baseball, a couple mestizos in basketball. If you go to the Philippines, man, it's like all imported Americans, right? You
yeah.
know, you see as many African American players, right, in their basketball league as you would
Yeah.
here in the
It's
United
the
States.
It's the David Fagan
Yeah. That's an
uh,
interesting way of putting it.
legacy.
Yeah, but
Yeah. Hey,
uh,
so Dan, we're talking about all this, and this is from
well,
our
Dorothy
conversation.
raised it. Dorothy really
Yeah.
was pushing the issue, and academics actually have partial answers to this,
All right,
and
who tells our story? Who gets to tell our story?
that's right.
The white
And
historian, right?
see, now Filipino academics have actually made major inroads in this, but I don't think the older generation that's now dying off. I mean,
All right.
Dorothy's 90 now, right? And
Yeah.
Peter just passed away. I think he was 94.
94.
And so they're rare in and of themselves as survivors of that generation. But they're pretty resistant. They were resistant, even though they were somewhat assimilationist, right? They were pretty resistant to this academic perspective, particularly on the psychology of Filipinos. And your buddy Kevin Nadal is one of the
My
foremost.
buddy.
He was one of the foremost.
Yeah.
He and
San Juan.
no,
No, Ramos.
San Juan is a philosopher. The
Right.
psychologist David.
David. Oh
He
yeah, yeah, yeah.
David in Alaska,
Yeah.
and
He did.
to extent Gabe Garcia as well.
Yeah. No, I
In
like the
Alaska,
psychologist as an
they're
explanation.
really good. They're
Yeah.
really good, but
It doesn't explain the history. I mean, because the thing I like about Kevin in his work, he talks about microaggressions. He talks about that all is important stuff, but it's not part of the history. You can't use it to. Oh, bless you, bless you. You can't use it to explain the history totally. Thanks for muting there. Dan
yeah,
is
I'm sorry, I missed the
you must
button on
be
that push.
allergic to Fonz officials.
No, anything but anyway. And you were saying what he
Yeah.
does about well,
I mean,
actually,
the thing is that the history. I mean, the psychological aspect is fine, but what we're not. History
well,
is not
he,
about
he,
about trying to
I
psychoanalyze
think what I should
historical
do is
figures.
I think I should write an article that blends the historic, the psychological point of view,
Mhm,
right, on
mhm.
historical events, because I have had conversations with Kevin
Yeah,
about the how do you explain this kind of behavior. So for example, when the famous, rather well, and it was celebrated or mentioned at least briefly in the
mhm,
Larry musical,
mhm.
was the so-called Watsonville riots, which
Right.
actually happened in Salinas, Watsonville, and Pajaro Dunes was the beginning of it, right? Um, and the death of uh, uh, God, why am I blanking on his name?
Yeah.
Uh,
I
anyway,
Fermin Tavera.
yeah,
Fermin.
Tavera, yeah, and anyway,
Fermin.
yeah,
Fermin.
he
Fermin
well,
Tavera.
so that was, and then the reaction from the Filipinos was, "Can't we all just get along on one side, right?"
Yeah.
And but there was a majority of people, and my father was there. He
Yeah.
said the white people were deputizing drunks, people on the street from the bars and stuff to organize and quote try to keep the peace. And he goes, on the other hand, there were Filipinos who were veterans of the First World War who were digging ditches and setting up defensive lines, in the campos.
For the Filipinos. Oh yeah,
They
in the
were
camp.
gunning up. They were gunning up. They knew what was coming, and they were gunning up. Nobody tells that story. Nobody. And my cousin Alex
They
Fatman,
were gunning it. They're preparing for an actual confrontation
confrontation.
with
Yes,
guns
yes,
against the whites
yes.
because Fermin Tavera was shot in his bunk, and they were
Well, yeah. I mean,
coming
clearly
to
they
get
had to defend themselves. There was clearly an attack, and so everybody tried to play that down, and that's one of the reasons that the story never got told, because they didn't want to provoke white people to then also retaliate by organizing further and then committing even further
yeah.
harm against the Filipinos. In the meantime, there was another reaction for the Philippines, and the reaction for the Philippines was, "We keep telling you that it's a racist country and you shouldn't go there."
Right,
Okay.
right, and
Uh,
then and so and what they were trying to do this is 1930,
yes,
1930, and then
30 and 31. Yeah.
just a few years before Tidings McDuffie, which said they placated the Filipino government and said we're
You're going to earn your way to independence over a 10-year period, right?
yeah,
Okay. But
yeah,
the shaft, here's the shaft. Well, what we call giving them the shaft
yeah,
is when things that you don't want in your body, are start to enter. Okay,
yeah,
and that shaft was, we're going to reduce your favored nation status,
yeah.
right? And so your exports and imports to the United States are going to start being subject to tariffs. Whoa, does that tie into contemporary issues? It sure
Yeah,
does.
yeah, and also, and Filipinos weren't allowed to come to America as
Well, it
easily.
was over. We were not going to
Oh,
be welcome immigrants anymore, and there was a follow up, the Repatriation Act, right?
oh yeah,
There
you can
were
go
there were
back.
only there were only two groups, right,
Yeah,
that were ever subjected to the possibility of forced return, or in the instance of Filipinos, voluntary return, and that was Filipinos and Mexicans. They were both
and
subjected to repatriation.
Tidings McDuffie in 1934. So this is after. I mean, the 1924 Immigration Act was the one that set the quotas,
Exclusions,
exclusion. But
absolute, against other
yeah,
Asians.
yeah, but not the Filipinos. The
Yeah,
Filipinos
well,
were
because
still
the
colonized.
American flag is flying over the
Right.
Philippines.
So they were still colonials, and they were able to come in, but the xenophobia was so high, they shoot Fermin Tabera, and they're ready to gun the Filipinos ready to gun up against the Americans, and this is all a precursor to 1934, the Tidings McDuffie
Yeah,
Act, which
and
is
the popular treatment is the reason white people reacted to Filipinos that way was because the exclusivity of a dance club that the Filipinos had at Pajaro Dunes, and the fact that they excluded white boys from coming into that dance club, and that the women who were the taxi dancers in that club were all white. Okay,
because they
and
like the white girl. They like the white
well,
girl.
okay. So the premise of and all of the history says that was the premise or motivation, and it ignores entirely the fact that Filipinos were successfully organizing labor groups. Okay,
Mm.
all over the country and particularly in California, they were
So
small and but they were already organizing labor groups. People like the folks who eventually were able to join the ILWU, Local 37 up in
yeah.
Seattle, right?
Mm.
Were already active, and they had already had labor organizing experience. Some of them in the Philippines, okay, believe it or not, and then especially in Hawaii. And one of the reasons Filipinos were coming here in significant numbers from Hawaii in the 1930s, late 20s and 30s, after having worked in Hawaii, was because they had successful strikes, okay, that were put down by force, right? The use of police and military. And then some of them were exiled. They were forced, Pablo Manlapit, for example, forced out of Hawaii, okay? And
So,
so
right,
many of those
because of the
people
strike.
moved over here. Yeah, they moved to the West Coast and they already had organizing experience. And so that was also another reason that there was animosity towards Filipinos.
Yeah.
And but that gets little or no mention at all. They just look at the sexual part, right? They just look at
Oh, the sex part
Filipinos
is a
and
good
white
part.
women.
Yeah.
Hey, I
Well,
told
but
you you can
they
make it.
did like the white women though.
You can make it, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and a lot of them were, mestiza Mexican, and the
Yeah.
white women. A lot of them also were the victims of ethnic prejudice. Italians. You out in those areas, the
Yeah.
families were starting to develop the ability to purchase property, and that's a whole nother story.
Yeah. Well, see, this we started out with our little Fonz conversation, and now we ended up with real California history. This is what happens to our conversations, but we still haven't answered the question: who gets to tell these stories and why? What? Well, that's the open question. But you brought up something at the end of the Fonz meeting yesterday, and that was, people are under. This is just history, and people don't know it, and we're under attack for telling history,
Yep.
and people want this history not to be told, and it should be told, especially in California. But
Well, it's a national movement, originating with white nationalism. It's a
right,
national movement. Uh, CRT, right? The
critical race theory,
going against critical race theory, which doesn't even exist anywhere except at usually upper division and graduate level universities, and it originated really in law schools and
right, right,
discussion around the philosophy of the development of law. And the
right,
critical race theory says, look, if you look at law and the American law particularly, you can see the meaning of race within those laws. That it's really stupid to say that it's not true,
yeah,
because it's historically clear, right?
yeah,
What if it's
yeah,
not true? Why were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments made? Why were they seen as necessary, right? Why was the Civil War fought, right? Was it because of culture and tradition, or protection of culture and tradition, the way the South likes to tell the story, right? Okay.
all right,
Or
I
was it
bet,
over freaking slavery? Was it
all right,
over economic and political issues alone, right? Or
yeah,
was it over slavery? Okay.
yeah, all right, but the point is, we are talking history here, and there is this movement to try to take away this history,
And that's
which
what
it
ethnic studies is. What
right.
the people were criticizing was not CRT. What they're criticizing is the telling of a story that ain't white. That's it.
And people like you're professor emeritus at the College of Ethnic Studies, San Francisco State University.
First one in
Are
the world.
are they under pressure to stop telling the history?
We have been under pressure to stop telling the history. Early on, it was an attempt to just do away with the College of Ethnic Studies. Well, at the time, the School of Ethnic Studies, and that was President Hayakawa.
Yeah,
He literally attacked the hiring of pattern of Black studies. It's
right.
now Africana studies.
Okay, but how about
Black studies.
today? I mean, today is there a move to try to silence or to get rid of ethnic?
On an individual basis, school by school, yes. Okay. On an individual basis, depending on how powerful, you know, the politics of the ethnic studies component at a given university, depending on that, right? The attacks are either greater or lesser. Is there constant pressure? That was the point that I was trying to make. There's always been pressure against ethnic studies. There's
Yeah,
always been a question, especially from the so-called traditional disciplines, right, as to the importance and meaning. Why are we spending tax money, in public institutions on this stuff when it's not important? Okay. Now it's worse than that. Why are we spending money on something that's challenging the way we see American society and the way we see it historically, right? Now,
right.
what's underlying that is that this should be understood as a white supremacy society. White people were meant to rule in this society. White culture is supposed to be the ruling culture in American society. Look at remember the 80s with the anti-foreign languages, right?
Yeah,
They wanted
yeah.
to do away with bilingual
Educate,
government
bilingual
services, right?
programs. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that.
So what we have is this renewed pressure against ethnic studies, and it's taking place at individual campuses.
It's
And
taking place at a national, on a state level here in California,
yeah,
because of the state passed a law, right, that ethnic studies can be credited towards graduation at the high school level, and then it has to be integrated into ninth grade curriculum. And
right,
so then that means that it has to be integrated into history books, right?
right,
And then the question is, well, whose story gets told and how
right.
is it told? And who are the people who are most at risk? Jewish Americans who are pro-Israel, right? And who do not want a Palestinian critical perspective included in those history books, or
So
any, for that matter.
that's sort of where the conversation or the debate is today, right?
Yeah,
I mean
well,
that,
it's been there for several years. Yeah.
but how threatened? I mean, the College of Ethnic Studies isn't being threatened, but
Well, economically it is, but it's both direct and indirect. The indirect thing is that SF State's enrollment is low. And
right,
so despite the fact that a lot of the power and authority to spend, right, whatever the funding is that goes to individual universities, that power residing with the presidents, the
yeah.
reality is that we get paid the same way that local school districts get paid, and it's body count. How many students are enrolled?
And
So if you have low enrollment, you get low funding.
so that's happening now. I saw there was
Yes.
a story about the low funding at SF State.
Yeah.
So the headline really is College of Ethnic Studies under the gun financially.
It is directly because everybody else is under the gun, and indirectly because the existing bias, right, the pre-existing bias against ethnic studies in whatever form, right,
It's coming
uh,
back.
is coming back. It's
Yeah, I
coming
mean,
back.
it used to be decried as basket weaving, and
Yeah,
now we see it as this is real American history. I mean, as we talk, this is the final day of November, and November is Native American History Month, and
it is.
I have to say that of all the history months, I mean, I love Filipino American History Month, but the Native the Native American month, November, is has really helped me understand what happened to Native Americans. I mean,
Yes.
I didn't really have a full understanding of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 until I read about it in a poem that made me want to read more. I mean, if it weren't for Joy Harjo and her poetry, I wouldn't really know much Native
Well,
American
that's
history.
why Andrew Jackson looks like a vampire on the money.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, I'm just saying that if it weren't for the former poet laureate of the United States,
Yeah.
Joy Harjo, I wouldn't know as much uh, Native American history. And if I didn't read a poem a day about Native American history this November, I would know less. And I feel like we didn't get enough history in school, in public
Yeah.
school certainly,
Yeah.
and
We we
certainly we
got
didn't get.
we got we got some mention in the Trail of Tears,
Yeah.
but we got some mention of Sitting Bull and
And
that
that's what.
story. Yeah.
But still, more mentioned than Emilio Aguinaldo.
Oh, and
And
we got early mention of the Iroquois and Algonquins, right?
yeah,
And the
right.
development of the longhouses and how the white settlers adopted, the longhouse elders
Yeah, and
kind
then
of concept.
of course we got Lewis and Clark in Sacagawea.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
there's
Sacagawea,
another one. Pocahontas.
Sacagawea story.
Second,
So,
well, we got the two women stories, right?
yeah,
Pocahontas and Sacagawea.
but I'm telling you, it's important to know this history, and it's not anti-American, but that's the way that the critics are trying to point to it and say and downgrade it and say, well, this is anti-American. We want to hear about
Yeah,
American
it's
stuff.
anti-American because they get caught in the vice
Yeah,
of being confronted by their racism. I mean,
yeah,
it's in the Constitution. It's in the freaking Constitution, right?
yeah, yeah,
Preservation of slavery as an institution is in the U.S. Constitution, right?
yeah,
The development of the 2/3, right, or the 3/5 rather. Okay, I was 2/3. I was thinking about the Senate, but
yeah,
3/5 compromise, right, was the creation of the electoral college,
yeah.
the existence of the electoral college, right, is is there, right, as a
Mm,
protection of the interests of pro-slave states. Okay,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, so this is a thing about when you go deep, you see how it's all interconnected, and you see how a push to get Filipino American history should be a natural thing
yep,
because we are all blended in there. Whether it happens to Latinos or blacks or Filipinos or Asian Americans in general, it happened. We're on the assembly line of history, and
some of us more than others, but
yeah,
nonetheless, right? We're all elements in that history, and the people who reject it or see it as threatening, right,
uh,
are immature. Frankly,
yeah,
they're historically and culturally immature. Uh, Canada has been forced to 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 accept their history of racism, and
yeah,
they are in the process of paying penance,
yeah,
literally. The Catholic Church and its abuse of Native American, but First Nation people, First Nation children. Okay, it's legend. It's
yeah.
legend, and they're paying a price for that.
And this is one of the things that happened just before the election, just before we got to November, and Joe Biden apologizing for the Indian American schools.
They didn't want to hear. They didn't want to hear. America did not want to hear. Look, we got a CR2 president. Damn it!
Yeah.
We
But
enough of that.
that was
Enough of that.
that was on the front pages, but the way it came out, I mean, I don't know if anyone was really paying attention. There was an apology, and I hope people who needed to hear the apology heard it because
Yeah, but
under Biden it happened.
they
You wouldn't
certainly
say
heard
that.
it. The
Yeah.
people who needed to hear the apology certainly heard it. But you
Yeah.
know what? They said, "So what?"
Yeah.
Okay, what's the
Oh.
reaction going to be from the rest of America
Oh
that
yeah.
continues to oppress us? Remember, there have been several things. There was a law to protect women generally, right?
Yeah.
In American society, particularly around laws that punish assault and rape. And why did the Republicans vote it down? Because it included women that had been injured or killed away from the reservation.
Yeah.
Right. So it literally, they said, nah, not Native Americans, literally that was the effect. Right. It was a specific isolation and exclusion, and they voted on it. And they did that ironically when we had the first two, right, Congress women, right,
Yeah.
who are Native American, I think one from Alaska and one from New Mexico. But what a laugh riot, huh?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, this
it's
is,
really, it's in your face. It's in our faces, and that's what they hate. They do
Yeah.
not want that. They don't want it pointed out.
But when you get to the history, that you can't help but see it pointed out,
It
and
is.
then
It's really obvious.
it's there. And the thing is, we need to know this history because
But we're
we'll
not here to make trouble like the
keep
others.
doing it. Yeah, I
That's
know.
the
All right,
Filipinos.
Dan.
Let's Asian Americanize it a little bit, right?
Yeah,
Everybody
well,
has had a different experience, but the one that's always common is that immigrants suffer, right? Depending on the ups and downs of the economy, right?
yeah,
Immigrants suffer attack, and
yeah,
so in the 19th century, it was Europeans that
yeah,
immigrants that were under attack, right? It
yeah.
was Eastern Europeans, it was Italians, right? It
Look,
was even Irish.
we're gonna have a version of, like I was saying yesterday at our meeting. You know what Peter Jamero did for me was he made me see that, the reason that my life is the way it is because I'm American born, second generation, but I was treated like the first.
Yep.
And we are going to see that play out again because people who are undocumented, they're going to be looked on. And if you look like them, there will be confusion.
Remember what happened? Well, confusion. There's no confusion. We look like we look, and we're therefore suspect. That's not confusing.
Yeah. Well, that's
Remember what
true.
happened when 187, is that, do I
Yeah.
have the
Yeah.
number right?
Yeah. Yeah.
187, 1994. That passes, right? Overwhelmingly, right? We're talking about almost 70% of the California voters voted in favor of 187. And
Yeah.
what were its main goals, right?
Yeah.
No public services for anybody who can't prove adequate legal documentation of their presence in the state. Okay, that was it. So no school, no emergency health
No,
care.
no social service.
No.
We beat that. 187 failed.
No, it didn't. It passed.
Yep.
209 passed. They both
209.
passed. I argued that 187 would fail in the courts, that it would get challenged as unconstitutional.
And that's where it failed.
Yes, and the major elements of 187 failed because they couldn't enforce it. But remember, Dan Lundgren, one asked, well, no, that was different. That was 209. But 187, people were arguing, it's not going to be us. That was the point I was trying to make. It's not going to be us because we're legal. Now, I saw interviews of Latino families, right, who hate to be called Latinx, who said, they're not after us, they're after the criminals, And the family the parents had entered the country illegally. They were themselves undocumented at one time, but they were saying, but it's not about us, they're after the criminals. And that's the same damn thing that Filipinos said in 1994. They said, it's not about us, it's about the Mexicans, right? It's about the Latinos, okay? It's not about us. And almost 1/3 of Filipinos living in California were overstays, were visa overstays, So they were undocumented. And then they're saying, not about us. And then 4 guys, legit, American citizens, were rounded up in Silicon Valley, and they went all the way to Arizona and were about to get shipped over by bus into Mexico before they were able to get assistance and proven to be American citizens. But Filipinos, it's
going to happen again. It's going to if the
mass happen again. It depends on what method they use. If they if they're going to try to use the military, it's going to die again in court until it goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and right along with their immunity
Right.
decision, they go ahead and say, "Nah, it's cool. He's commander in chief. He can do it. He can do it." Okay, and if
No,
they start using that, is there going to be resistance from within the military? All right, because
so
their freaking allegiance is to the Constitution, not to the president, not to the commander in chief. It's to the Constitution. But then it'll be really interesting, right? Because if the Constitution is reinterpreted by
and
this really Trump friendly Supreme Court,
yeah,
what
and
happens?
the generals will, can who are loyal can go against it. So, well, we are up against it in the coming year.
It's going to be real interesting. All we
Yeah,
can do right now, I'm getting ready to teach a winter session class, and I'm going to tell them all we can do right now is just watch and see what happens.
yeah,
Okay, you can't be presuming that he's actually going to succeed at doing any of the wild and crazy things that that he's always wanted to do. And people say, well, yeah, he's just talking. He tried to do it. He
yeah,
tried to do it in his first administration, and people within his administration said, "No, you can't do that." And he kept firing people.
yeah.
So
I'll find the
you're going
right
to
guy
tell
to say
me,
yes. Yeah. Well, this is where we're at, and but it means that there's still a fight. There's a fight to be
There
had.
got
It's
to
not
be
just
resistance. There has to be
yeah,
resistance. And
yeah,
when I said when he was elected the first time around, and people said, it's I don't do, and you really believe that we're heading towards a fascist state? And I said, well, here's the definition of fascism. What do you think? Right? People say, oh, we're a long way from that. This is PhDs. This is my fellow
yeah,
professors, right?
yeah,
At SF State, which is seen as one of the most liberal institutions on the universe, right? Yeah, and they're my fellow professors were questioning my perspective on fascism and the possibility of its rise during a Trump administration. This was in February. February, and right after he took the oath, man. And
yeah.
they were telling me that, and I was saying, okay,
You know,
here we are. Here we are. If you think all PhDs are smart or
yeah.
liberal, you better think again. You
Well,
know.
Dan, you have once again uh, we've we've gone on too long.
Oh, dude, this is reality has gone on too long.
Reality, no. You've once again you've illuminated our conversation with little bits. We just started talking about the Filipino American National Historical Society, and we've come to mass deportations. But we're going to have to revisit and figure out, because one of the things that came out was the generational differences, not just the
Absolutely.
class, not just
Yeah.
not just when you came, but also the generation. How do you deal with older people who are now being cast off as, well, they're not cool. They're not. They're
Yeah.
I mean, the
Well,
institutional memory of that group is really at stake.
I think there's a very small. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the general population of Filipino Americans, I don't think they have that much value for the history. That's a major element of the problem.
That
Because what
oh
you know they
well,
just don't value it.
let's come back and talk about that again.
Sure.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk. We did mention our friend Peter Jamero, and God
It's
bless his
it's
soul.
it's a big loss, but man, what a high achiever! Just a great life.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Good guy. Able to laugh at himself, able to tell stories, other people's stories, without injecting himself
yeah.
into
And
the story. Yeah.
injecting himself with Ozempic, you mean? No,
He didn't need that.
he
He was
didn't.
in good shape. He was in really good shape.
I
But
like Peter. We joked around a lot, but our
yeah, that's we'll
conversation,
see. But you could, right? I mean,
yeah,
he was a very humorous dude, so it
yeah.
was fun.
And we had a nice conversation. You can check it out on Emil Amok Stakeout, wherever you podcast. Peter Jamero, myself, and Dan Gonzalez. Always a pleasure to have you on. Happy Thanksgiving again.
Thank you.
And
Well,
let's,
we're thankful that you do these programs, and we're thankful for your friendship and your
yeah,
insight. Most of all, we're thankful for your insight.
all my insight, the inside and
Insight,
outside. Yeah,
very perceptive,
thank you.
deep, talaga.
Thank you. Thank you. In that group meeting we had yesterday, there were a lot of like post 80s immigrants, and you had the younger ones.
They were
And
younger generation. Yeah, people
I,
maybe in their 40s now, late
Yeah,
30s,
I
early 40s.
appreciate them. I appreciate them, and
Me
they're
too.
doing good things. They're doing good
Me too.
things.
Yeah, no,
But
I wanted to have more conversation with Jennifer
yeah,
Santana.
Jennifer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she was
Jennifer
really
was.
good because
Yeah,
she's
yeah,
successful member of the DOL, Department of Labor,
yeah,
following in tradition of the great work done by William
yeah.
Tamayo. But
Bill. Yeah. So no, we'll have more conversations. I hope to get Jennifer on the show and talk to
yeah,
her.
let's do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
do it. All right,
All
man.
right. So
Thank you
Dan,
very much.
take care. And look, have a great post Thanksgiving. Try not to consume too much anything. It's
Yeah, no, leftovers. We killed that yesterday,
yeah.
so we're into brand new food again.
Grandpa, this is mass consumer weekend. So
That's
try
right.
to not
That's right.
consume. Say
And
no.
and non Black Friday. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
I quit. I told Linda, man, we ain't doing malls anymore. We ain't doing Black Friday, and I made that decision like 15 years ago. I said, nah,
yeah.
no.
Yeah. Well, there's still like online and Cyber
Yeah, yeah.
Mondays
There's all
coming
kind
up.
of stuff. Yeah, and
So anyway.
I go like at 9:30, right before it closes. Right, if I'm gonna
Oh
have
yeah.
to hit the mall, I go
Yeah.
when everybody's leaving. Yeah,
Oh yeah. That's a good time.
swimming, against the stream. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
All
All
right,
right.
man.
Dan, take care,
Stay
man.
out of
Happy
gas.
Thanksgiving. All right. Take care. All right. There he goes. Daniel Phil Gonzalez, my friend. College of Ethnic Studies, San Francisco State University, Professor Emeritus. We always like to gab a week in review, but the news seems so, you know, there are other things to talk about related to the news that gets back to the things that are in the headlines, like the studying of history. The studying of history. All right, so let's see, I gotta use my swish here. We're swishing out. Thank you very much for being with us. You can see us. Um, yes, fascinating discussion. It's always a fascinating discussion. And now I must return to whether or not I'm going to buy that thing I want to buy. Now I don't. The mass consumer. No, just saying no. You got everything. You got everything's inside. Everything's on the inside. Everything's on the inside. Just let it go. Let it go. Um, Check me out on Patreon. Patreon.com. Patreon. Patreon.com/Emil Amok. We post many of these videos. Become a member. You can communicate with us there. Please communicate with us there at patreon.com. You can join, be a member. You can pay, be a free member, communicate there. Check out my columns on substack.com/@Emil Amok, substack.com/@EMILAMOK. YouTube, if you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. You can see it here on YouTube, youtube.com/@Emil Amok1. All these different things, different gizmos. And Facebook, of course, and X, Twitter, @Emil Amok. All right, we close with a little some plugs. Carla Blank's A Jew in Ramallah and Other Essays. Check it out. Carla Blank, A Jew in Ramallah and Other Essays, published by Baraka Books. And it's kind of interesting. Where is the ceasefire going to bring us? Are we going to have a ceasefire? Is it going to extend to Gaza? What's going to happen? Carla Blank writes a nice essay about, her experience. A Jew in Ramallah and Other Essays. What else? I guess that's it. I'm going to close. We like to close with a little meditation. A little meditation. I like to do laughter yoga. I sometimes when I get to this point, I said, "Oh, let's do laughter yoga." I do that on Patreon. Go on Patreon because the laughter, releases the dopamine and in your head and the oxygen. Right? It's like eating like 70% dark chocolate. That's what you need, right? But I like to leave with some loving kindness. And so, as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you live with ease. Oh, let me mention Jackie Cation's Dork Forest. This month I did my Dorkdom Filipino history. So check it out. The Dork Forest, Jackie Cation's podcast, review podcast. Check out Emil Amok's Takeout review podcast. It's a little different from these shows. And that's it. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend. Until next time.